How do 14 men steal 3-axis ships in 30 minutes inside a neutral harbor at midnight without turning a single pier lamp into a witness and without giving diplomats a photograph to wave in anger? How do they make an Italian freighter, a German tug, and a diesel barge slip their chains and follow 2 British tugs into the dark as if obeying a private tide? How do you commit an act that looks like piracy and file it the next morning under a different word that makes the law nod and look away? This film answers those questions. Not yet. First the scene, then the method, then the minute hand's sprint that turns rumor into history. Stay with it. The harbor is Santa Isabel in Spain's island colony of Fernando Po, today's Malabo, on the night of 14th of January, 1942. The ships are the Italian Duchessa d'Aosta, the German tug Likomba, and the barge Bibundi. The men are a composite of Britain's small-scale raiding force and the special operations executive carried by 2 unglamorous tugs named Vulcan and Nuneaton. The promise is simple before this story ends. Every how will have an answer, and the most important answer will not be about explosives. It will be about paperwork. The maps still called it Spanish Guinea. The flag still promised neutrality. And neutrality in 1942 had a particular flavor. It was a waiter's smile at a table where 2 enemies tried to eat in peace. Santa Isabel's harbor lived on that smile. Coasters huddled against the mole, their lines furred with salt lanterns, throwing small circles of yellow onto water that pretended to be still. In the roadstead loomed the Duchessa d'Aosta. Fat with cargo and reputation, a merchantman with a working wireless, and the habit of hearing things she should not. Nearer the pier, the German tug Likomba sat like a bull with sinew to spare. Alongside the diesel barge Bibundi, ugly and useful, waiting for a master to give it purpose. A neutral harbor, as it turned out, could be crowded with everything war needed, except a reason to be honest. The men who would remove those ships from the ledger did not arrive wrapped in myth. The small-scale raiding force, Num 62 Commando, was still an experiment in nerve and scale, a proof that small hands could move heavy objects. Major Gus March Phillips had built it with impatience, and a converted fishing trawler, Maid Honor, that had sailed from the English Channel to Freetown, looking for submarines and finding instead a coastline full of opportunity. The Special Operations Executive, the SOE, had already threaded an agent into Santa Isabel's social fabric. In a port where everyone knew everyone, Richard Lippett made himself useful in the way that opens doors he carried. News-organized parties, asked small questions, forgot the answers he did not need, and learned which officers liked the band, which preferred the bar, and which of the 2 would rather be ashore on a Wednesday night. He learned also how routines grow roots in neutral soil, valuable knowledge for anyone planning to cut metal without drawing blood. The plan that congealed looked criminal because its simplicity resembled audacity. 2 tugs from the Nigerian government, Vulcan and Nuneaton, would ferry the raiders to the island. A party ashore would bait the trap, a dinner with candles and polite music, drawing Italian officers from the Duchessa d'Aosta and a pair of German guests from the Likomba. At sea, folding kayaks, full-boats would be lashed and unlashed until every man could deploy one in the dark without swearing at the sea or the hinges. Boarding drills would be turned into muscle memory hands on cold rungs, weight placed where steel does not complain, bodies moving like water over a low rail and into shadow. Explosive charges would be rehearsed until timing ceased to be arithmetic and became reflex. The goal was not to blow a ship free, but to make her chains sing once and part clean, so that the harbor's first waking thought would be of aircraft, not intruders. There was a second plan behind the first, a legal mask waiting to be fitted at dawn. A Royal Navy corvette would patrol beyond the 3-mile line with an empty logbook and a full understanding. If all went to schedule the next morning, she would come upon the 3 Axis vessels under tow and bring them under prize law, writing into her book a story elegant enough to satisfy a foreign office that wanted results and deniability in equal measure. The Spanish could rage. Berlin could broadcast. London could gesture at the page. If the sea can wash away footprints, a neat log entry can do the same for a night's work. The opposition to this plan did not come first from enemies. It came from friends who had memorized the word neutral and feared the word piracy. Theater command in West Africa balked. Headquarters in London weighed the risk that Madrid might climb a diplomatic ladder built of angry adjectives. The argument felt familiar. Victory needs room to breathe. Law needs room to stand. The compromise was to pay the raid in rehearsal instead of blood, and to insist that it end at sea where names change. If Santa Isabel could be left technically untouched, there would be little for the injured to point at, and much for the operation's defenders to fold into a file. And so men practiced in the Gulf of Guinea heat, under a sky thick with insects and the kind of sun that dries salt into patterns on skin. They trained until the clock itself began to look like an ally. On the afternoon before the operation, the island's air had a lethargy that suggests nothing will happen. Lippett's invitations were delivered with all the ceremony of a town used to making the best of boredom. The band tuned. The table linens were paler than the palms which framed the veranda. Officers in white predicted an evening of harmless distraction. The Italians had come prepared to be bored in style. The Germans brought a certain gravity, the kind that drinks slowly and watches doors. None of that mattered. The point was not gaiety, but geometry. Bodies ashore meant fewer eyes on deck. Out to sea, Vulcan and Nuneaton laid their courses with the fatalism of workboats. Engineers tended engines that smelled of iron and old oil. The raiders checked their gear and their watches and the lines they would trust to hold thousands of tons in obedient trace. In every rehearsal, someone had asked the question that 50 years later would still crown any telling of this story. 30 minutes, why 30? The answer was as impolite as it was true, because any longer risked witnesses, and witnesses invite adjectives, and adjectives ruin operations. 30 minutes was not a boast. It was a ceiling. Night dropped like a curtain pulled by a careful hand. The harbor lights made small halos. The wind forgot it had a job. On shore, a song was played that had been a hit far away in a country at war. At sea, a whistle blew once in the dark, and 2 tugs that were never meant to be famous ran in toward a neutral harbor with their names painted on their sterns and their intentions wrapped in silence. Vulcan nosed for the Italian freighter. Nuneaton steered toward the place where the German pair lay, one hulking, one squat, both complacent. The time was a few minutes past 11 on the night of 14th of January. The island's hills held the warmth, the water gave back an oily light, and the pier sentry practiced boredom badly. Everything depended now on the balance between audacity and routine, between the confidence of ships in a neutral port and the nerve of men who had come to tell steel to change owners. Boarding a ship quietly is an apprenticeship in patience. A boat's bow must kiss hull, not thump it. Hands must find holds by habit, not searchlight. Feet must remember which rung belongs to a heel and which will sling a man backward into black. On Vulcan's deck, the first group bunched and then stretched into a thin, intent line, a shadow rising up the Duchessa d'Aosta's flank. One man caught the rail and did not drag it. Another guided a second's boot onto the tumble home with a push at the ankle. A guard on the afterdeck turned at the last possible second, saw shapes where shapes should not be, and obeyed the oldest logic, a hand on his shoulder, a second finger to lips, a third gesture toward the companionway. Below decks, a light burned over a chart table for no one. Someone switched it off with a solemnity that in peacetime would have been comic. Anchor cables do not understand politics. They understand stress. Fore and aft, raiders clip charges where steel meets strain, where a small violence persuades a larger muscle to let go. A careful wire run. A murmur not loud enough to qualify as language. A check of the time in the blind face of a watch. The explosive in question was measured for music, not spectacle. The goal was a note that would echo off buildings and be mistaken for something that falls from the sky. When the first charge snapped, the sound was a metallic syllable, stretched into a shout. The second followed. The chain played its one permitted song. The Duchessa d'Aosta shook herself like a horse freed of a post and felt the tug on her stern line. Vulcan's engines answered with torque rather than speed and began to walk the freighter out of her neutral sleep, while that orchestra performed the second act, had its cue. Nuneaton slid up to the German tug, and the barge locked beside it. Here bluff would be the first tool and decency the second. A voice in the dark said something a watchman expected to hear at this hour in a harbor, a captain returning a line to attend a polite curse about a lantern left where it should not be. The watchman froze long enough for two shadows to become four. Then the rails were not simply rails. They were ladders for men who had come to repeat the method on a smaller scale. Likomba took her hijackers with professional indignation. Bibundi was a hull with no personality and surrendered on command. A pair of sentries, unwilling to guess at who owned the night, chose the water and were dragged out of it with rough respect, onshore. The first sleepers woke to the arithmetic of fear. A bang plus a bang equals an air raid. Eyes look up. Anti-aircraft guns, sleepy and eager, coughed tracer into darkness and were disgusted by the absence of an enemy. The coastal artillery, older and more conservative, demanded a target it could name before it would spend a shell. The harbor policeman, whose whistle could have turned curiosity into alarm, could not decide whether to blow it for the sake of procedure or keep it silent for the sake of not being wrong in public. That uncertainty was worth more than any explosive carried that night. The tow lines took their loads as if they had rehearsed from birth. Thick rope knows pride when it earns it. Vulcan leaned and found her strength. Nuneaton complained and yet obeyed. The Italian freighter's bow began to point at water that did not belong to Spain. The German tug felt a new master at her hip. The barge, so often a passenger in life, learned quickly how to be cargo. From approach to departure, the clock would, when the arguments were done, show 30 minutes. It is a number history loves because it looks like theater. It felt in the moment like the minimum required to pay the bill for nerve. There were small hitches that proved men, not gods, ran this show. A mooring line fouled a cleat and had to be persuaded with a knife. A fullbot drifted into a shadow that was more concrete than water and had to be rescued by a hand that did not curse until later. Someone miscounted prisoners and counted again and found the number correct. A face appeared at a cabin window and then vanished when a finger pressed the glass, suggested that sleep remained the wiser choice. On the pier, a trio of silhouettes conferred and then separated, each certain he had been the first to know and therefore the least likely to be blamed. When the headland swallowed the last of the mole lights, the harbor returned to its first question. Had anything happened at all, the guns cooled. The air made noises that had nothing to do with war. On the veranda, the band packed instruments with the professional despair of men who understand that history would not be paying their tab. At sea, the tows settled into their new math. The Italian ship trailed like a stubborn monarch who has been told the palace now has a different address. The German tug glowered without hope. The barge made no comment, and the two British tugs, still anonymous to anyone who had not studied their sterns closely, put distance between audacity and regret. Dawn does not care about neutrality. It reveals. The plan had accounted for that. Beyond the colonial boundary, a small warship held an empty space in her log and a full set of intentions. HMS Violet. Tidy and unspectacular followed her line on the chart until a signalman lowered binoculars and found himself looking at the bureaucratic answer to last night's riddle. 3 Axis vessels under tow in open water. A corvette proceeds to board. The captain's pen waits to convert nerve into a legal posture. The border is a fiction until ink makes it fact. Vulcan reached the rendezvous first with the Duchessa d'Aosta, in dignified tow. There is a point at which a stolen object ceases to be the property of its previous owner and becomes a fact too large to reverse without scandal. This was that point. Boarders came over the rail from the corvette with the ritual efficiency of men who take no joy in embarrassment, but appreciate victory's cleaner clothes. Papers were examined to the extent that papers mattered. Seals were broken where seals had been smudged by sea air long ago. Men in neat blues regarded men in oil-stained denims and nodded in the way professionals nod when craft recognizes craft across a branch boundary. Nuneaton was slower. Her engines, honest but elderly, made their objections known in language an engineer can hear in his bones. A Nigerian collier, Ilorin, answered semaphore and gave help that neutral observers might later describe as neighborly rather than complicit. Likomba and Bibundi came along like furniture, hauled from a house, in a hurry the kind that will be refashioned later to suit new room. Lagos would see all 3 prizes, eventually a freighter with a radio that would not make another mischief, a tug with power to spare, for allied convenience, a barge ready to be any shape of usefulness. In Santa Isabel, the morning found officials writing adjectives. Outrage is a pen's favorite word when pride is hurt without evidence pierced. The Spanish colonial administration counted the ships as if counting could conjure them. The island's governor wrote a telegram that sounded better in a Madrid office than it read at a key. The Axis radio service built a fiction big enough to be believed by those who preferred anger to arithmetic. British destroyers violating neutrality depth charges, dropped in a harbor gunfire, hushed by fear. The more details invented, the less corroboration required. Meanwhile, London could point at a single, neat log entry aboard a corvette and let that line do what proof does in wartime, end conversations that might otherwise ramble into embarrassment. Inside the small fraternity that had authored the thing, there were rituals to complete. Reports were written with an elegance that comes from relief. March Phillips' name moved upward on lists of men to watch. Geoffrey Appleyard's cool competence attracted a second glance from superiors who understood that calm is a weapon. A Danish private Anders Lassen found his legend starting to write itself from 2 quiet sentences in an after-action note, first over the rail, first to plant a charge. The SOE men ashore received thanks that looked like understatement and were in their way a form of envy. A party with candles had disarmed a ship more efficiently than a broadside would have. Medals would come later, clipped to ribbons that do not rust even if the stories pinned to them do. Outside the paperwork, something softer and less measurable took hold. In the messes up and down the West African stations, men retold the 30 minutes with the precision all good rumors earn. The soundtrack was always the same, the metallic song of a chain parting the low swear of an engineer whose cylinder decided to be temperamental at an inopportune hour, the absurd cough of an anti-aircraft gun, waking to a nightmare in which there were no planes. In those retellings, a truth was smuggled in under the laughter. This was a kind of war that made sense to people who were tired of large, blunt instruments. It was surgical without being sterile. It had the grace of necessity. Madrid slowed by distance, and dignity managed to be both outraged and practical. The Spanish state could not afford the appearance of weakness in the colonial theater, but neither could it afford a rupture that would feed German appetites or British scorn. The harbor was technically unviolated. The evidence had obligingly removed itself to a jurisdiction where different verbs govern maritime behavior. The complaint therefore shrank to fit the available facts. By the time the argument returned to Europe by cable, it had lost the heat that attracts headlines. In Berlin, the propaganda was loud for a week and quiet thereafter. In London, the operation joined a file with a name that sounded like an errand postmaster. The men who had made the 30 minutes possible did not enjoy a long immunity. Within months, March Phillips would die on a French beach, his impatience turned to bravery, and then to a date. Graham Hayes would vanish into the cruelty of a prison system that measured dignity in hope's last increments, and would be executed after 9 months of a loneliness designed by policy. Appleyard would be listed missing in action, the words that make families learn how to live, with a sentence that refuses to end. Anders Lassen's road would run toward Italy and a posthumous Victoria Cross. The raid remained, as raids do, a point on a larger graph whose axes are cost and effect. Meanwhile, the ships lived new lives. Duchessa d'Aosta's cargo, wool, hides, tannins. Copper mundane things made strategic by scarcity went into the maw of a war economy that had learned to be grateful for any commodity that did not arrive riddled with salt water. Likomba would push and pull under new orders. Bibundi would carry all the things barges learned to carry when wars rewrite schedules. Their new names mattered less than the fact of their unavailability to the enemy. In a conflict where tonnage is a number and morale is a multiplier, removing 3 hulls from the wrong column is an act that has effects far beyond their displacement. Type continue to get the next part. The easiest way to misunderstand this operation is to admire only the audacity. The harder and truer way is to see the choreography. Each part existed to make the next part inevitable. Invitations ashore to empty a deck, tugs to give nerve muscle, full bots to give silence reach, charges sized to make a particular music, tow lines cut and dressed for work, not drama, a corvette's pen poised to write a small legal miracle. The result looks like theft because efficiency resembles theft. It looks like luck because rehearsal, when it works, wears luck's face. There were technical secrets hidden in plain sight. Cutting an anchor chain in the dark is a bad idea. Breaking it is better. The catenary of a chain, the sag under its own weight, can be turned into an accomplice. A small explosive at the right link under the right tension parts. Steel with a clap rather than a tearing scream. The ship then moves like a surprised animal that discovers it has been tied to a post only by habit. A tug with torque faces her stern to the open water and translates surprise into motion. Meanwhile, in a neutral harbor, witnesses do what they were trained to do, interpret bangs as bombs. Anti-aircraft guns fix eyes skyward and leave the water alone. The law watches the line on the chart and says nothing until ink gives it a phrase to use that does not disgrace it. There were human secrets as well. Watch bills on a neutral anchored ship grow lax in the absence of fear. A party ashore implies peace more loudly than any decree. Uniforms disguise intent less well than posture. A man moving like he belongs is harder to arrest than a man in the right clothes moving like a thief. Politeness deployed in a whisper on a dark deck can herd sailors better than a shouted threat. And then the discipline afterward, the absence of triumphalism, the refusal to fan stories with boast, keeps the operation clean in the only way that matters to its authors. It can be repeated in principle without inviting an equal and opposite fiasco. Deniability is not an apology. It is an instrument. The brilliance of the corvette's log entry was not merely that it protected diplomats. It protected the method. If a neutral harbor can be relieved of Axis ships without leaving a legal bruise, more such harbors will learn to be careful with their invitations. That caution slows the enemy with a kind of ghost pressure. Everywhere they anchor, they will sense a choreography rehearsing just over the horizon. The war of nerves is not won only in trenches and over cities. It is won in quiet offices where harbor masters decide to be grumpy, and in private rooms where officers decide that the best party is the one they attend aboard their own ship. The raid's place in the genealogy of special operations is not in its daring alone. It is in its proof that scale is a choice. A battalion could not have done this work. A squad could not have conjured the paperwork. 14 men with 2 tugs can, if their work is twinned with the patience of an administrator and the tact of a governor willing to lend his boats, move a column of numbers that otherwise would have made trouble for a year. That proof changed appetite at the top. Plans once dismissed as stunts gained audiences. Commanders whose instincts leaned toward siege learned to tolerate sleight of hand. It is not that one raid rewrote doctrine. It is that one raid gave doctrine permission to expand its vocabulary. After the raid, Santa Isabel returned to its routines with the self-respect of a place that refuses to believe it was ever fooled. This is wise. Harbors have long memories but short pride. The pier learned a lesson and forgot it. The band played again. The colonial offices filed long memoranda with short conclusions. Neutrality survived because it had been treated with an odd courtesy, violated only technically honored by the absence of bodies left on stone. The island woke for a time to the knowledge that water is a road more than it is a fence. For those who prefer narratives to numbers, there is one more scene worth holding. Picture the boarding party's leader pausing on the freighter's deck after the second charge had done its neat work. The ship slides incrementally, like furniture freed from a rug. The harbor's noise comes in thin, frightened threads. The stars seem closer when a man's hearing is full of steals after song. Somewhere in town, a glass drops and shatters in a bar because hands cannot help playing the tale again for themselves. Somewhere else, a child sits up and thinks the storm has begun. The man shakes off the scene because scenes are for after, and after is a privilege. Operations like this win for others if they do not succumb to admiring their own reflection in the water. And for those who insist on counting, count this. 3 ships removed from an enemy's convenience. A radio silence that might have stitched Allied movements into a map for U-boats to read. A tug's muscular obedience transferred from one master to another. A barge that will carry coal or crates or any other prosaic necessity that keeps a war fed. A neutral harbor taught gently and efficiently that routine is no armor. 14 men whose names would scatter across later pages, some to honor, some to ellipses, proving that 30 minutes honestly spent can write a sentence the enemy needs a paragraph to deny. We return to the questions with which we began and answer them without flourish. How do 14 men steal 3 Axis ships in 30 minutes inside a neutral harbor at midnight? by refusing every indulgence that is not essential, by turning hospitality into absence, by using carefully sized violence against metal and none against men, and by giving the law a morning scene it can accept. How do they get away with it? They do not, in one sense. The names go into a file, and the file survives. But they do in the sense that matters for strategy. The ships go where they are told. The papers say what they must. The outrage peters out because it cannot find a handhold. That is not luck. That is craft. The promise at the start was to make the how-s yield. Here, finally, the sequence in one breath so a viewer can hold it in a single frame. A West African coastline alive with agents and rumors presents a problem. Axis ships in a neutral harbor, useful, listening, untouchable by ordinary means. A small Allied raiding force born of impatience and method pairs with a civilian-faced SOE network and borrows 2 tugs whose paint remembers cargo more than glory. A baited party ashore empties key decks at the hour when routines are most convincing. 2 tugs slide into a harbor whose guns are aimed at a future that refuses to arrive. Folding kayaks and low voices bring men from water to steel. Charges are placed not to make a point, but to produce a sound that the town will mistake. Tow lines take the load. The harbor decides, as all bureaucracies do, at midnight to wait until morning. Outside the line on the chart, a corvette completes the trick by renaming it. 3 ships change columns. Diplomats scowl. The record quietly smiles. The legacy lasted longer than the headlines. In the year that followed, Allied planners spoke the language of choreography more freely. The SOE's West African desk traded in the authority that only a neat success buys. Combined operations had one more story to bring to a prime minister who prized the morale effect of small victories as much as their material yield. Special operations doctrine, such as it was, drew from the raid a gentler axiom: a little law correctly handled is as sharp a tool as any blade. If a corvette's log can become a shield, then a raid can avoid being a bomb that explodes on a diplomat's desk. The multiplication of these lessons changed decisions at a level where commanders choose between waiting and risking. The line shifted a notch toward risk, and that notch would, over months and oceans, matter. There were shadows, too, that keep the story honest. The leaders who had the nerve to accept 30 minutes of chaos at Santa Isabel would pay for their temperament elsewhere. The bargain at the heart of raiding trade time and nerve for a result, you cannot buy wholesale, extracts a personal price. Remembering those names at the end of this tale is not a ritual. It is the cost column. It also explains why, for all the love storytellers have, for capers, professionals keep the romance leashed. They admire the craft, not the cartoon. If there is a single image to close on, it is not an explosion, but a line of ink drying in a ship's book intercepted outside territorial waters. That sentence is either the driest of bureaucratic prose or the neatest of moral mechanics. It kept a neutral port's pride intact. It spared the raiders from becoming headlines with faces. It let Madrid register injury without bleeding. It let London claim firmness without boasting. It allowed the war to be fought in that corner on terms that honored efficiency and avoided spectacle. This is not to prettify a theft. It is to define an art, the art of doing the necessary with a minimum of harm and a maximum of effect. At the very start, the questions were posed like a dare. How, with rehearsed nerve and small explosives that spoke the right language to steal, inside a neutral harbor, by respecting the shape of neutrality even as you pressed its edges, leaving no bodies and a minimal bruise. At midnight, because sleep is an ally if you invite it. In 30 minutes, because planning is a jealous god that rewards those who worship with time and precision. And the last question that no one asks aloud: why does the story still pull at attention? Because it shows a kind of power we want wars to remember, a power that can be audacious without cruelty, clever without mockery, decisive without swagger. If this history gripped you, if the metallic song of a parting chain, the hush of a harbor choosing not to see, and the quiet authority of a corvette's log all linger, leave a comment with the image that stayed in your mind. Share this with someone who loves the craft of operations, and subscribe for more cinematic ground-level histories where the little clock in the corner of the frame is as important as any banner.